My name is Naomi Carter. I was 28 years old when I discovered that silence can leave scars far deeper than the harshest words ever spoken. The first thing I remember was the steady, rhythmic beeping of the machines beside my hospital bed. The air carried the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the late afternoon sun slipped through the blinds, casting narrow bands of golden light across the blanket covering my legs. A nurse leaned over me with a kind smile and gently asked if there was anyone she should call. Without a second thought, I recited my parents' phone numbers from memory. I never questioned whether they would come. If there was ever a moment a family should show up, surely this was it. The hours dragged by. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking each time to hear another phone call go unanswered. One nurse tried, then another. Someone even left detailed voicemail messages explaining that the hospital urgently needed to reach my family. Every attempt ended the same way. Silence. At first, I refused to believe the worst. Maybe they were driving. Maybe their phones had died. Maybe they were panicking and didn't know what to do. I kept inventing reasons to protect people who had spent most of my life teaching me to understand everyone else's feelings while quietly overlooking my own. As daylight faded and shadows filled the room, memories surfaced one after another. Birthdays rescheduled because my younger sister, Olivia, had other plans. Graduation celebrations were delayed because she needed help preparing for another opportunity. Even the smallest family gatherings somehow revolved around her, while my own accomplishments received little more than a polite acknowledgement before everyone's attention drifted back where it always seemed to belong. On their own, those memories had never seemed important. But lying in that hospital bed, listening to another unanswered call ring somewhere far away, every disappointment began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I'd spent years refusing to complete. Close to midnight, my attending physician quietly entered the room. Instead of standing at the foot of my bed, he pulled up a chair and sat beside me. That simple gesture told me this conversation mattered. With gentle honesty, he explained that the hospital still hadn't been able to reach my parents. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Is there someone else you trust to make decisions if you're unable to? For the first time in my life, my family's names never crossed my mind. I looked at him and quietly replied, "Please call my lawyer." As I waited for him to arrive, I still believed my parents' silence was just another painful disappointment. I had no idea the truth behind it would reveal something far more heartbreaking and far more life-changing than I could have imagined. My lawyer, Daniel Brooks, arrived shortly after 1 a.m. His calm presence brought a sense of stability the room had been missing. He didn't overwhelm me with questions or offer hollow reassurances. Instead, he pulled up a chair, placed a slim folder on the bedside table, and gently asked how I was feeling. For a moment, I couldn't answer. I was exhausted, frightened, but more than anything, I felt embarrassed. The only person sitting beside me wasn't a parent or a sibling. It was the attorney I'd hired years earlier to help settle my grandmother's estate. Somehow, he had shown up when the people I loved most hadn't. Before discussing anything legal, Daniel asked whether the hospital had finally reached my parents. The nurse standing nearby quietly shook her head. Then, almost reluctantly, she admitted that someone had finally answered one of the calls, only to say they were busy with a family commitment before hanging up. Those words settled over the room like a weight. A family commitment. I desperately wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. I searched for any explanation that might make it hurt less. But deep inside, an old familiar ache already knew the truth long before my mind was willing to accept it. The next morning, a message from my cousin confirmed everything. My parents hadn't been stuck in traffic. They hadn't been dealing with an emergency. They had spent the entire day helping Olivia move into her new house across town. The family group chat was filled with smiling photos, everyone carrying boxes, laughing over pizza, celebrating her fresh start. Mixed among those cheerful pictures were the hospital's missed calls. Every single one had been marked as seen. Every single one had been ignored. I stared at my phone until the words blurred together. What surprised me most wasn't the pain. It was the fact that I didn't cry. Maybe those tears had already been shed over the years, one disappointment at a time. Every forgotten birthday. Every postponed celebration. Every moment I'd convinced myself I was simply being too sensitive. They had quietly drained me dry. What remained wasn't peace. Not yet. It was something just as powerful. Clarity. The kind that only arrives after asking yourself the same painful question for years, and finally receiving an answer too obvious to deny. Daniel waited until I locked my phone and set it back on the bedside table. "You don't have to make any decisions today," he said softly. "But whatever you choose, make sure you're seeing things as they truly are." His words stayed with me. For the first time, I realized this wasn't only about recovering from an illness. It was about deciding whether I would keep reaching for people who had spent years showing me exactly where I stood in their lives. Somehow, that choice felt even more important than the medical decisions my doctors were asking me to make. The days that followed blended together in the strange way hospital days always do. Time inside the ICU moved according to its own rhythm. Mornings began with the quiet hum of monitors. Afternoons disappeared into medication rounds and routine examinations. Nights stretched endlessly beneath the soft glow of hallway lights. Every time my phone buzzed, hope flickered for a brief moment. Maybe this time it would be my parents. It never was. Instead, thoughtful messages came from coworkers checking on me. My elderly neighbor sent a handwritten card wishing me a speedy recovery. Someone anonymously delivered a bouquet of fresh lilies whose gentle fragrance filled my room every morning, quietly reminding me that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who remember you most. On the third day, my parents finally called. I watched my phone ring twice before answering. My mother's voice sounded rushed rather than relieved. "We just heard you've been in the hospital," she said. "Why didn't anyone tell us it was this serious?" I closed my eyes. The silence between us carried everything neither of us was willing to say. They had been told. The hospital had called again and again. Those calls weren't unanswered because no one tried. They were ignored because my parents chose not to answer them. Hearing my mother speak as though they had simply been left out hurt more than I expected. Before I could respond, my father took the phone. He explained that Olivia's move had been impossible to postpone. Then he added that they assumed I was stable because hospitals often called repeatedly as a precaution. It wasn't an apology. It was a carefully rehearsed list of excuses designed to make their decisions sound reasonable. Years ago, I probably would have accepted every word. This time, I simply listened. When the call ended, Daniel returned carrying the same folder he'd brought on that first night. Inside were the legal documents I'd signed years earlier, naming my parents as the people authorized to make medical decisions if I ever became unable to make them myself. Beside those papers, he placed a blank form. "You don't have to change anything," he said quietly. "But you also don't have to leave those decisions with people whose actions have already answered that question for you." I picked up the pen. For a long time, I simply stared at the paper. Every promise they'd made. Every excuse I'd accepted. Every disappointment I'd explained away. I realized how often I'd mistaken hope for evidence, convincing myself that one day things would change simply because I wanted them to. Then, with a steady hand, I wrote a different name. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. It was the first decision I'd ever made based on who my family had shown themselves to be, instead of who I kept hoping they would become. They didn't know it yet, but that single signature would change everything when they finally walked through the ICU doors. My parents arrived the following afternoon carrying flowers and expressions of concern that probably looked convincing to anyone who didn't know our history. My mother hurried to my bedside, smoothing my blanket as though that familiar gesture could somehow erase the days she hadn't been there. My father stood near the window, commenting on how much healthier I looked, carefully avoiding my eyes. Their concern had finally arrived. Only after the worst was over. For a while, we stayed on safe topics. We talked about my recovery, my doctors, even the weather outside. It was the kind of conversation families have when everyone is avoiding the only subject that truly matters. Then my mother smiled and casually mentioned Olivia's new house. She laughed about how exhausting the move had been. The words escaped before she realized what she'd admitted. The room fell silent. A few moments later, Daniel knocked softly before stepping inside. Out of respect, he'd waited outside to give us time alone first. Carrying the familiar folder, He greeted my parents politely before explaining that because they couldn't be reached during my medical emergency, I had chosen to update my healthcare directives while I was fully capable of making my own decisions. There was no accusation in his voice. No anger. Only calm, undeniable facts. My father's expression changed first. "You replaced us?" he asked quietly. For the first time since they entered the room, I looked directly into his eyes. "I didn't replace you," I said. "I accepted the decision you made before I made mine." No one spoke. The silence wasn't filled with anger. It carried something heavier. Recognition. There were no excuses left. No explanations. The hospital records spoke for themselves. So did the unanswered phone calls. And now, so did the signed documents resting inside Daniel's folder. Those facts told the story more honestly than any argument ever could. As my parents stood there holding flowers that had arrived days too late, something inside me finally became still. The hardest part wasn't accepting that they had failed me. It was admitting that I'd spent my entire life chasing their approval, believing every achievement, every sacrifice, every act of patience might finally earn the love and attention I'd been waiting for. For the first time, I stopped waiting. After they left, an unfamiliar stillness settled over the room. The bouquet they had brought sat on the windowsill, bright and carefully arranged, yet somehow completely out of place. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the flowers, I realized I was no longer mourning the family I had. I was finally letting go of the family I had spent my entire life wishing they would become. For the first time, I wasn't replaying the conversation over and over in my head. I wasn't searching for better words or wondering whether I could have explained myself differently. There was nothing left to prove. Some truths don't need perfect arguments. They simply need to be accepted. The next morning, my Aunt Evelyn came to visit. She carried a faded canvas bag that had once belonged to my grandmother, the one person who always seemed to notice what everyone else overlooked. From inside, she carefully pulled out an old journal and a bundle of letters tied together with a worn blue ribbon. "She asked me to give these to you when the time felt right," Aunt Evelyn said with a gentle smile. "I think she'd say that time has finally come." After she left, I sat alone and carefully opened the first envelope. My grandmother's familiar handwriting covered every page. She wrote about quiet strength, about how the dependable child is often mistaken for the child who needs the least. She admitted she'd noticed the imbalance in our family years before I ever had. She worried that my kindness would be mistaken for endless patience and that my willingness to endure would slowly become something everyone simply expected. Then I reached a sentence that stopped me in my tracks. "Never measure your worth by the attention of people who have forgotten how to truly see you." I read those words again and again until the ink blurred behind my tears. This time, I wasn't crying because I felt invisible. I was crying because I finally realized someone had seen me all along. My grandmother hadn't left behind bitterness. She hadn't encouraged revenge or asked me to prove anyone wrong. Instead, she gave me something far more precious. Permission. Permission to lay down a burden that had never belonged on my shoulders in the first place. As I folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, I understood that my healing hadn't begun with medicine or surgery. It began the moment I stopped searching for love in places where it had always come with conditions. For the first time, I believed the life waiting beyond those hospital walls could be different, and that every choice I made from that moment forward would shape the person I was finally becoming. A week later, I was strong enough to leave the hospital. The moment I stepped outside, everything felt different. The cool air carried the fresh scent of rain lingering on warm pavement. After days surrounded by sterile walls and the constant rhythm of medical equipment, even the ordinary felt extraordinary. Daniel walked beside me without saying much, carrying my overnight bag while my discharge papers rested neatly beneath his arm. Before getting into the car, I paused and took one long, steady breath. For years, nearly every major decision I'd made had been influenced by one hope: to finally earn my family's approval. This time was different. For the first time, I wasn't trying to find my way back to their expectations. I was finding my way back to myself. The weeks that followed were quiet, but they changed my life in ways no one else could see. I updated every legal document. I reorganized my finances. Most importantly, I let go of the silent belief that it was always my responsibility to rescue everyone else whenever a family crisis appeared. None of those choices came from anger. They came from acceptance. Life had already shown me the truth. I was simply allowing my decisions to reflect it. That's when I finally understood what healthy boundaries really are. They're not walls built to punish people or keep them out forever. They're doors that remain open only for those who have shown they know how to walk through them with respect. A few days later, my mother called and asked if we could meet for coffee. When she walked in, something about her seemed different. The confidence she usually carried had been replaced by quiet uncertainty. We sat together for several minutes before either of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. She admitted that reading the hospital records and seeing page after page of unanswered calls had shaken her more deeply than she'd expected. "I kept telling myself we'd call back in a few minutes," she whispered. "Those few minutes became hours, and I never stopped to think about what that must have felt like for you." I studied her face. It was the closest she'd ever come to taking responsibility. But even the most sincere apology cannot erase years of quiet neglect. "I'm not asking you to carry this guilt forever," I said softly. "I just need you to understand why things can't go back to the way they were." She nodded as tears filled her eyes. Neither of us reached across the table. Some distances can't be closed in a single conversation. Still, as we stood to leave, I realized something important had changed. I wasn't walking away hoping she'd regret losing me. I was walking toward a life where I no longer had to compete for love, attention, or a place in someone else's heart. And with every step, I felt lighter than I had the day before. The weeks slowly turned into months, and I realized my recovery had become about far more than healing physically. I eased back into work, finding comfort in familiar routines and coworkers who welcomed me with genuine warmth instead of obligation. Little by little, my apartment stopped feeling like a place where I simply slept between responsibilities. It became home. I filled it with small things that brought quiet joy: a cozy reading chair by the window, my grandmother's journal resting on a wooden shelf, and a framed photograph of us laughing together in her garden. Each one reminded me that the deepest kind of love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's gentle, steady, and strong enough to stay with you long after someone is gone. My parents continued reaching out from time to time. Sometimes it was a simple text asking how I was doing. Other times they invited me to dinner or suggested spending the afternoon together. I always answered kindly, but I no longer rearranged my life every time they called. At first, they didn't understand. For so many years, they'd assumed I'd always return to the same familiar role, the dependable daughter who asked for very little and expected even less. But every time I calmly declined an invitation that didn't fit my own plans, they slowly realized this wasn't a temporary reaction. My boundaries had become part of the life I was building. A few months later, our family gathered to celebrate Aunt Evelyn's birthday. Olivia was there too. For the first time, I didn't compare my life to hers or wonder whether I measured up. I simply enjoyed being present. During dinner, my father started telling a story about how stressful Olivia's move had been. Halfway through the sentence, he stopped. His eyes met mine across the table, and I watched something soften inside them. "We should have been with you that day," he said quietly. The room fell silent. No excuses. No explanations. Just a truth that had taken months to find its voice. I smiled. Not because everything had been repaired. Not because the past had disappeared. I smiled because honesty had finally replaced the silence that had lived between us for so many years. In that moment, I understood something I'd never fully grasped before. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the pain never happened. It means refusing to let your deepest wounds write the final chapter of your life. As the evening sunlight spread across the dinner table, I realized my story was no longer defined by everything my parents had failed to give me. It was defined by everything I had finally learned to give myself. A full year has passed since the day those emergency calls went unanswered. Every now and then, my thoughts drift back to that quiet hospital room, the steady rhythm of the monitors, the antiseptic smell in the air, and the thin lines of sunlight stretching across my bed while I waited for voices that never came. The memory is still with me, but it no longer carries anger. Now, it reminds me of something far more important. It reminds me of the day my life quietly changed direction. What once felt like abandonment became the first step toward freedom. My relationship with my parents is different now. We still talk. We spend holidays together. We share ordinary family moments. But our relationship is no longer built on silent expectations. It's built on honesty. They understand now that trust doesn't return because of one apology or one emotional conversation. It comes back through consistent actions, one choice at a time. Things have changed with Olivia, too. I stopped blaming her for a role she never asked to play. In return, she slowly began recognizing the space I'd quietly surrendered for years. Neither of us changed overnight. Healing rarely works that way. It happened through one conversation, one honest moment, one small step at a time. I still think about something Daniel told me before I left the hospital. He said the most important documents he'd ever handled weren't the ones filed in court. They were the ones that marked the moment someone finally decided to value their own life. It took me a while to understand what he meant. The papers I signed in the ICU did more than update legal records. They marked the moment I stopped confusing love with endless sacrifice. More importantly, they became a promise to myself. A promise that I would never again allow my own voice to be the last one I listened to. If there's one thing I hope my story leaves with you, it's this. The people who fail to recognize your value never get to decide what you're worth. Sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do isn't spending your life trying to earn someone's love. It's realizing you were always worthy of it. Daniel didn't rescue me from my family. He simply stood beside me while I found the strength to rescue myself. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest act of justice wasn't watching others realize they had lost me. It was making sure I would never lose myself again. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, consider passing it on to someone who might need the reminder that healthy boundaries aren't acts of rejection. They're acts of self-respect. And if you enjoy deeply human stories about resilience, forgiveness, family, and the quiet courage it takes to rebuild a life, I'd love for you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join me again for the next story. Until then, take care of yourself. Your voice matters. Your life matters. And you deserve to be seen.